Welcome to the show. I'm so excited to have you on with me this evening. I have to admit, I've only read one of your books, and it was a great book. It was The 25 Most Mysterious Places in the World. I know that's a fairly old book for you, maybe 10 years old, but I actually learned a few things. There were like 7 places I did not know about, so it was very interesting. It was wonderful, but before we get into your 2 latest books, I want to discuss with you a little bit about Bigfoot. And the reason why is because my dad had a sighting of him back in the early 80s. Nobody in the family believed him, but I believed him. And I knew he was telling the truth. And the way he was explaining it to me, even though I was 10 years old, he had driven up to Reno, Nevada to pick up my aunt. There was a blizzard. He was driving through the snowstorm, and my aunt was sleeping. And he said that this upright, ape-looking creature crossed the road. He saw this thing crossing the road. I could see the look in his eyes when he was telling the story, and just the disdain with people not believing what he was saying. It was very vivid and real for him. And till that day, I have been fascinated with this creature. Can tell me a little bit more about your discoveries with Bigfoot?
Well, yeah, I've investigated sort of Bigfoot-type reports all over the place, really. Originally from England. A lot of people don't realise there's a long history of very similar reports coming out of the UK. And when I've been to Puerto Rico looking for the Chupacabra, I've also heard stories coming out of Puerto Rico of Bigfoot-type creatures, and also here in Texas. I live in Dallas, but East Texas, as it goes towards Louisiana, is very heavily forested. And there's one particular large area of forest in South Texas, called Southeast Texas, called the Big Thicket. And a lot of Bigfoot-type reports come from there. So, we get sightings all over the place.
I agree with that. There's been many, many sightings through the years, especially in areas, in my neck of the woods in California, but Washington, Oregon, New Mexico, Alaska. Do you think there's a correlation between these creatures and, say, UFOs or even aliens?
Well, I think there's definitely, I don't know if I'd directly say with aliens, but there's no doubt in my mind that there's sort of like a paranormal aspect to Bigfoot. I don't think it's just like the North American equivalent of something like an African gorilla. There are a lot of weird cases where Bigfoot appears to be a flesh and blood creature, but it also seems to have the ability to vanish before our eyes, sort of flit in and out of our reality. And a lot of mainstream cryptozoologists don't like dealing with these sort of rogue type cases. They want to just keep everything in the flesh and blood unknown ape category. But I don't think seriously there's hardly a researcher of Bigfoot out there who hasn't at least got a handful of these weirder stories, whether they do anything with them or not. And for me, I do something with them. I investigate them, and the sheer number of reports that do fall into these weirder categories of people seeing these things and them vanishing, or even where people claim telepathic contact with them. I think the number of credible people who've made these claims, to me at least, it suggests that Bigfoot is something weirder than just an undiscovered ape. And I think it probably falls into the category of something like a paranormal entity, or something that flits in and out of our reality from other realms of reality.
Now, I do have a question coming from the chat room, Nick, and it was, when was Bigfoot first spotted?
Well, that's a good question, because the term, or the word Bigfoot, isn't even 60 years old. It actually was coined in the United States, I said not even 60 years ago. However, if you go back and look into, for example, 19th century US newspapers, and also British newspapers, you can find stories of what, particularly in the US at the time, were known as wild men, or wild men of the woods. And numerous sort of local newspapers in many towns, you can find them, sightings of strange ape-like creatures that, when we look back at them now, they're clearly describing the same thing that today is called Bigfoot. And there are also stories going back to Native American early times when the European settlers came over, and they talked about seeing hairy giants in the forests of the Pacific Northwest and places like this. You can go back even further. For example, in England, where I said where I'm originally from, there's a story of a little town on the east coast called Orford, and Orford has a story of like a hairy wild man who was supposedly captured and imprisoned in the local castle at Orford, and this is like in the 11th century. So, in other words, Bigfoot by name only goes back to the 1950s, but Bigfoot in terms of people seeing weird, hairy, humanoid-type creatures, that actually goes back, right through recorded history.
Wow. Well, that makes sense. I know a lot of the natives have said they've had sightings and whatnot.
Yeah.
How does this creature, how does he remain hidden from everyone? I mean, and what happens to the dead? I mean, obviously, these creatures, do they pass on? Are they immortal? There's so many questions.
Actually, that's one of the reasons why I think Bigfoot isn't just a hidden ape and nothing else, because if it was just like the equivalent of an African gorilla or something like that, we would by now have at least one body, whether through just finding the animal dead, or it being hit by a vehicle, or a hunter successfully shooting one. Most people never see mountain lions in the wild. Most people never see bears in the wild, but people do see them, and people do shoot them, and they do end up in zoos, and they do get hit by vehicles. Just not that often, but it happens. But Bigfoot eludes us 100% of the time with a 100% success rate. And so for that reason, that's why I take the view that, when people say, why isn't there a body? Why don't we find remains? Why don't they get hidden by cars? Well, that's because, as I see it, they're not regular animals. There's something weirder about them. And I think why we only see them at certain times and then they seem to be gone is, I actually think that's literally what's happening, that they're from a different reality to ours, and that they're only temporarily in our reality before they jump back into their own. And that's why they're so elusive. And it's also why I think they can be seen sometimes near very built-up cities. For example, I mentioned earlier, I live in Dallas. Well, I can actually drive barely an hour and be in an area of woodland where people claim to have seen literally 12-foot tall apes. Now, there's no way that only an hour's drive from Bigfoot, an hour's drive from Dallas, that a colony of 12-foot tall Bigfoot could hide from us and not be captured or found. It's impossible. And yet that's exactly what's happening. So again, I think that we're dealing with something that's only temporarily in our world, and that explains, for me at least, why they're so elusive, why we never catch one or kill one.
Maybe they go into a portal, like a worm.
Yeah, something like that, like a portal, however people want to term it, like a gateway, a portal, but to somewhere else that sort of coexists with us. I mean, things like quantum physics, and physicists are theorizing today on the idea that multiple dimensions could exist, and if we knew how, we could access one from the other. But we don't know how to do it. We don't understand the science or the how to do it. But maybe, these creatures can do it naturally, maybe just as natural as breathing is to us,
They have an extra gift that humans don't possess, maybe,
Yeah, and I think, there's a lot of questions that sort of provoked by the elusive nature of Bigfoot and how things like this can exist in a highly advanced country but never be caught.
Well, thank you for clearing that up a little bit. I've always been fascinated with the creature, and I'm sure my dad is smiling down because that day he saw that creature, it was just as vivid to him as it ever was until his dying day. He talked about it. So,
Well, that's good. But, one thing I would stress is I do want to stress I think these things are physically real. I don't think they're like a ghost or anything like that. I think they're physically real, but that still doesn't prevent them from jumping out of our reality. So, in other words, people really are seeing, some sort of flesh and blood animal, but it's a flesh and blood animal that acts in a very different way to us and can literally sort of possibly even dematerialize from our from our realm.
That's fascinating. Thank you for kind of elaborating on it a little bit. I've been wanting to get someone on for a long, long time that's an expert in this subject, and you've answered quite a few of my questions. I'm going to shift gears a little bit here, and I want to talk about your new book, the zombie book, the Encyclopedia of the Living Dead. This has my teenager written all over it. Everything is zombies in my house. Zombie apocalypse, moving warm bodies with the zombie love story. I'm dealing with zombies, so I thought you should listen to my show. It's going to be about zombies. Fascinating book. Tell us a little bit about this book.
Well, it's a book I did with Brad Steiger, and it's probably the longest book I've ever written. It's about getting up to 400 pages, I think, and it's like an A to Z of everything to do with zombies, whether in movies, TV shows, popular culture, history, mythology, folklore, superstition, and even conspiracy theories. And so in other words, you have entries like V for virus, and A for Armageddon, and P for pandemic, explaining to people, what these terms actually mean in relation to how they become part of zombie law, if you like. And so it's, as it covers everything from like voodoo to scientific attempts to sort of resurrect the dead, how real world viruses work versus how the zombie virus of TV shows and movies work, and things like that.
Well, now, they say that this is like an epidemic of the living dead. Would you say that is true? Or, how does... I see things in the movies and whatnot. I think there was a British comedy, something, Dawn of the Dead.
Oh, Shaun of the Dead.
Shaun of the Dead. Oh, my God.
Yeah.
Hilarious. I just watched it a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah, that's a funny film.
It's pretty funny. I got a big kick out of it, and I started thinking about it, going, that's the question I'm going to have to ask Nick. How does this come about? Is there people doing, bad drugs, or is it fiction, or is this reality?
Well, it depends on how, the answer to that question depends on how you sort of define what a zombie is, because in today's movies and TV shows, zombies are pretty much 99.9% of the time linked with like viruses and epidemics and the end of the world and the collapse of civilization and all this, and sort of every man for himself. But that imagery really has only existed since the 1960s, when people like George Romero, who made Night of the Living Dead in '68, that kind of introduced the world to that kind of zombie. But zombie movies have been made way back until the 1930s. But all the classic zombies of that era, like I Walk with a Zombie, White Zombie, and King of the Zombies, all those films had nothing to do with the end of the world or viruses or epidemics. They dealt with like the old school zombies, which were sort of like not dead people who rise up and attack the living, but mind-controlled slaves that were in almost like an undead state, but it was actually due to things like toxins and poisons that affected the nervous system and the mind and controlled them. And there actually are certain toxins that sort of voodoo priests and priestesses understand, and how a person's mind can be controlled and a person sort of plunged into this zombie-like state. So in other words, the old school zombies, not just in fiction, but in reality in the world of voodoo, they're as human as the rest of us, but they're in a sort of a mind-controlled state. But the zombies of, TV and movies, the dead literally coming back and attacking people, that's just fiction. There's no real world precedence as far as we know that anybody has actually, been bitten by somebody who's already dead and suddenly come back to life and, raced around attacking people or whatever.
Looking for brains.
Exactly.
Well, I know it's a big phenomena, and, a lot of people are fascinated with it, and this book sounds fascinating. I'm going to have to purchase this book, and we can get this book on, Amazon?
Yeah, you can buy it at Amazon, and you can also get it off the shelves in Barnes & Noble. As I said, it covers all aspects of of the whole zombie tradition. And what's interesting, there actually are some ancient legends, particularly coming out of China and also from Scandinavia, of creatures that sound actually like today's zombies. For example, China had one called the Jiangshi, which was a zombie-like thing that, you know, a person would die and they would come back to life and they would look weird. And Jiangshi basically means stiff corpse. And that was how they would describe as walking. They would have like this shuffling, slow, stiff movement like zombies. And they would reportedly feed on the living, but instead of like feeding on flesh and blood, they fed supposedly on like the human soul, the life force, which they would suck out of the body of the person. But for all intents and purposes, the description, like these shuffling, stiff bodies and pale faces, and they smell really bad, they sound just like today's zombies. So you have to wonder, you know, where did that come from? Where did that idea originate in China thousands of years ago, that the dead could rise up and they would have this sort of weird marching stiff movements and they would attack people? You know, it kind of sounds like there may well have been some virus that did sort of mimic, you know, the closest thing today that we have to the zombie virus.
Well, you know, it's definitely, you know, some people say it's urban legend, but if it's going back thousands and thousands of years, you know, there's so much lost information that people are really lacking, you know.
Well, I personally, people ask me, you know, do I think the dead are going to sort of, you know, a plague is going to kill people, and it's going to be some sort of plague that can reanimate them and make them just driven to kill and eat people? I think that's highly unlikely to ever happen, because when physical death occurs, you know, destruction of the body and everything happens very, very quickly. So in other words, the virus would have to have the ability not just to affect the person's mind to where they become like homicidal and cannibalistic, but where it would repair the body to allow it to function again. That's the difficult part. But what I would say is that if you watch zombie films like 28 Days Later or 28 Weeks Later, or the movie version, the recent movie version of World War Z, in those movies, the zombies aren't actually dead. What happens is that they get bitten, and this virus takes over their body and mind, and they look different, and they just become rabid, and they are driven to bite people and spread the virus, and then as soon as they've bitten someone and spread the virus, they pass on to the next person and the next one. So they're driven not to eat people, but just to spread the virus. Now, we actually have something very similar to that in the real world, which is rabies. Rabies, when a person develops rabies, that's probably the closest thing we have to a real-life zombie virus, in the sense that as the person progresses with the disease, or with the virus, I should say, they become more and more psychologically disturbed, and eventually they just become downright violent and potentially murderous, and they have to be restrained and held down. And there's really not much chance of them recovering at all then, you know, it's almost zero. And that's, you know, those people are, when they're literally rabid, they are about the closest thing to like in World War Z or the 28 Days Later, 28 Weeks Later movies. So if, you know, somebody, some crazy scientific type was able to sort of mutate the zombie virus with something like the flu virus, where potentially it could spread airborne as well, you could actually have something that would affect the minds of people who were bitten, to where they would be sort of filled with rage and, you know, homicidal thoughts and so on, and they would be driven to bite someone and spread it again. So that could actually happen. So, you know, something like the zombie virus, but not literally the dead rising up, I think, you know, is actually quite feasible.
Interesting. I don't know if you heard this, Nick, but I think it was a couple of weeks ago, somebody in Africa that had Ebola had died, and they were calling it the zombie effect because she came back to life. And I don't know if you've heard that in the news.
Well, I've not heard that one, but I mean, the guy who, you know, the guy who just died recently, who came over, he died a few days ago.
Right.
Who came over. He actually died in a hospital just not far from where I live. And what a lot of people don't realise, and this There is actually kind of one parallel between Ebola and the zombie virus. You know, the zombies are dead and they're still lethal. You know, they come back and they bite you. Well, a lot of people don't realise that the people who die from Ebola are still life-threatening after they're dead. A lot of people don't realise that the Ebola virus remains active in the person for several days, even after clinical death. And that's why, let's say, for example, somebody with Ebola dies on a Monday morning, even if they're not sort of buried till the Thursday or the Friday, the people burying them have to be in full hazmat outfits, because even after that amount of time, you can still contract the virus, even though they've been dead for 3 or 4 days.
Wow.
So in that sense, Ebola is, you know, I mean, as I said, I just live not far from where the guy died. I mean, it doesn't stop me going to Dallas. I'm going to Dallas tomorrow. You know, the way I look at it, you can't live in fear of what might happen.
Exactly.
You know, you get hit by a bush, you could get struck by a meteorite, you know. You know, I'm going to have a day down in Dallas tomorrow. But we do need to be aware of how viruses spread and can happen quickly. For example, in 1919, a lot of people don't know, that's less than a century ago, there was a huge outbreak all across the planet of what was called Spanish flu. And between 1918 and 1920, it killed 40 million of the world's population. You know, that's a huge amount. That's like 8% of the US population dead. But a lot of people don't know about that, or they forget about Spanish flu, not even realizing it even happened. But that was less than a century ago. 40 million people killed from a virus. So something like that could happen again. So we do need to sort of be aware, but also not get sort of over hysterical. I mean, I'm sure everybody remembers a few years ago, everyone was talking about bird flu. We're all going to die from bird flu. Well, we didn't. You know, Ebola to me is like yesterday's bird flu. It's keep it in perspective and just don't go insane, hysterical about it. You know.
Or when SARS came out, remember that disease, SARS, and some guy...
The way I look at it, Ebola is yesterday's SARS, and it's the day before that's flu virus, and, you know, a lot of it is just, it's hysteria.
That's
of
it.
People not understanding. Yes, I mean, you know, something like 600 people died from bird flu around the world, and that's tragic for those 600 people. But in the context of how many people just die every year of regular flu, it's literally, people who die every year from regular flu is either thousands upon thousands upon thousands. And yet, you get 600 people die from bird flu, and the world goes into a panic, you know.
Well, our media has a lovely way of doing that to its public. They just freak the hell out of everybody. You know, it's like mass hysteria. That's why I try not to watch a lot of mainstream media for that one reason.
Well, yeah, I think I always tell people, I mean, just learn the facts. I mean, like I said with Ebola, yeah, it's a very serious thing, and I think we need to be careful as to, you know, who gets in the country and whichever country, you know, and it's not being racist to say if you're coming from an area of Africa where Ebola's rife, you're not going to be let in. That's not being racist, that's being safe, you know, and that's what we need to do. We need to be safe.
That's true. It doesn't have anything to do with the color of one's skin. I mean, you can come from South Africa and you're white. It doesn't matter. It's a precaution that people need to take and be aware of, you know. But at the same time, don't, you know, freak out and board yourself up in the house.
Don't live in fear. Don't live in
Exactly.
fear. Yeah, exactly.
Well, thanks for clearing that up a little bit. I have yet to bring up the Ebola thing on my show yet, and voila, here I went and did it. Now, I want to talk to you about your next book that you had written called, I find this one I have to get this one, The Close Encounters of the Fatal Kind, Suspicious Deaths, Mysterious Murders, and Bizarre Disappearances in UFO History. That is fascinating, Nick. Explain a little bit to me about that.
Yeah, sure. Well, that book's kind of split into two sections, in the sense that one part of the book, or I say one part, it's actually split across chapters, but part of the chapters deal with people who have have either died, been killed, or literally vanished while chasing UFOs. I'm talking chiefly like pilots and things like that, where they've been pursuing a UFO in the skies and they've never been seen again, or the plane's plunged into the ocean or a lake or into the ground, and there's a link with the UFO phenomenon. And the other part of the book deals with UFO researchers, authors, investigators, witnesses, who maybe have got a little bit too close to the truth, and somebody has essentially, targeted them for assassination, but made it look like suicide or accident to prevent them getting any closer to the truth and potentially, blowing the whole thing wide open.
Well, I do know our government, listens to us. I mean, back when I was doing AM radio, the owner of that station used to have a fit with me because there were many times the whole station would power down, and it was usually when I was talking about interesting subjects. I had a guest on talking about Lockheed Martin, and all of a sudden the whole station powered down and went dead for like 15, 20 minutes. And I kind of sat there going, am I being paranoid, or are they listening to me?
Well, I mean, I kind of have I guess it's like an interesting alternative approach to the whole conspiracy thing that a lot of people in ufology disagree with. A lot of people in the UFO field view the government or the Air Force or the CIA or whoever, as the bad guys, and they're the ones hiding the truth and killing all these people. I actually, personally, don't think, as I point out in the book, I don't think the government as an entity, and by the government I also talk about all the agencies, I don't think they're involved at all in killing any of these people. What I think is happening is that I think the UFO subject, or the secrecy, doesn't today fall under the control of government. I think it falls under like what we might call like a shadow agency, one which operates outside of government. It's like a very powerful body, but it's been essentially privatized in simple terms. And I think these are the ones who are responsible. I think today's military, it's a strange concept to consider, but I think today's military and government are actually out of the loop. And as I said, it's been siphoned off to these sort of huge, powerful corporations that do work into things like advanced biology and viruses and metallurgy and science and technology, because they're the ones who can understand it. The military is trained to fight wars, and the intelligence communities trained or taught to eavesdrop. Neither group really is in a position to handle and do autopsies on alien bodies. That's not their mandate. So that's why I think it's kind of been, as I said, farmed out to what we would call like a private shadow agency that is answerable literally to no one. It has a powerful group, it strands all across the planet. If you imagine something like an agency of the official world linked or connected to something like an ancient society like the Illuminati, I think that's what it is. It's like a powerful group of people who essentially, in some respects, almost like run the planet, but they're outside of government. And I think part of what they do is control the secrecy surrounding UFOs, and I think it's them and not the government at all that, has sort of wiped some of these people out.
Now, would you say this is maybe something, I know you talk about this in, I believe, in another book called The Collins Elite? Is it Okay. That's what I was wondering, if that's what you're talking about, the Collins Elite.
Yeah, the Collins Elite is kind of a similar thing, where that deals with a book I wrote called Final Events about 4 years ago, and it dealt with a group of people in the official world who basically set up like a private think tank to address quite an interesting but also highly controversial theory, but they came to the conclusion that the UFO phenomenon isn't extraterrestrial or interdimensional. They came to believe it was literally demonic. And when I say literally demonic, I mean, according to Christian teachings and beliefs, they believe it was like a demonic, deceptive thing that was presenting itself as extraterrestrial as a means to get its claws into us, so to speak. But the interesting thing about the Collins Elite was they were sort of like this concept I talk about of a shadow group outside of government, because although at some point they had all worked in government, they created this sort of think tank that operated outside of the conventions of governments. And although they reported back their findings to people in government that were interested in their conclusions and theories, they actually weren't part of the government. You know, they were like a private think tank. So this is where you have this sort of hazy angle of, you know, secret investigations undertaken legitimately, but where, in terms of legality and reality, they're not actually done by government agencies. You know, it's work that's farmed out, and very often the agencies themselves, truthfully, when they say they don't know, they actually don't know. You know, because it's all done outside of the military or whatever.
Interesting. No, I believe that, though. There's our government that's in place, and then there's a secret government that I don't even think our presidents are aware of. There might be a few.
That's what that's who I think probably is hiding the UFO stuff. And a lot of people, they sort of point the finger at the Air Force about when the Air Force says we've got no files on Roswell, and they say, you know, the Air Force is lying or whatever. I don't think the Air Force is lying. I think today's Air Force is as baffled as us by Roswell, that they I truly think they, you know, they're thinking, well, obviously something happened at Roswell, but why don't we have the files? And I think the reason they don't have the files is because, you know, again, they were transferred out decades ago, to the point where today's Air Force is no more in the know, I think, than we are.
Now it's all privatized by, you know, millionaires, I think, in certain aspects of it.
Yeah.
Now, with this book, you talk about, you know, people who have conveniently timed heart attacks that have been reported. They've vanished and never seen again. Is this happening on not a daily basis, but is it happening? Is this a frequent occurrence with certain? I mean, do you know people that have disappeared?
Well, I mean, that's a good question, because the one thing I point out in the book is that, I mean, over the years, since 1947, when the term flying saucer was coined after a famous sighting by a pilot named Kenneth Arnold in Washington State, since 47, which is almost 70 years ago now, there have been thousands of people in the UFO field, whether writers, researchers, authors, journalists, lecturers, investigators, abduction researchers, that kind of thing. And clearly, you know, the vast majority of those thousands of people have lived out regular, normal lives. Absolutely nothing's happened to them. So, in other words, the number of people I talk about in the book is somewhere in the region of about 50 or 60, which is still a lot of people, you know, to be killed, if you like, in the name of hiding the truth about UFOs. But what I found is that the ones where it seems that something genuinely suspicious did happen to them was where they were on the verge of releasing something huge, or they were on the verge of potentially uncovering something huge, and somebody took steps to prevent them from, you know, revealing this or revealing that. And that's what I found. It's you know, it's not, if it was everybody was dropping like flies, then clearly, you know, the mainstream media would be all over it, and everybody would be all over it, because it would be such a huge pattern. But when it comes to the angle of, you know, sort of 60 across 60 years, maybe one or two a year, then I think that's why people sort of write these cases off as well. You know, one suicide out of a few thousand people in any walk of life isn't hard to find, or, you know, a car crash amongst every 2,000 or 3,000 people isn't hard to find either. So I think that's why many of these cases have gone unnoticed, because they're significant ones, but there's, you know, in terms of the sheer number of people in the subject, they're not actually that many. They are sort of 50, 60, 70 across 50, 60, 70 years.
Interesting. No, I believe that. I'm going to ask you another question here. NASA. You wrote a book called The NASA Conspiracies, and I haven't read it, but a friend of mine read that book, and she has just kept talking about it and talking about it. Do you think NASA knows a hell of a lot more than they're saying? I'm sure they know probably more than the president or some of the higher ups.
Well, again, yeah, I think it kind of ties in with what I said about the whole UFO secrecy angle, is that, excuse me, the average, you know, employee of NASA I think, legitimately knows no more than the rest of us do. You know, they just do their legitimate programs to send probes to Mars or into space or to launch satellites into Earth orbit and that kind of thing. And they don't know anything about the UFO subject. But, I mean, could there be people at the top of the chain in NASA who know a great deal? Yes, there could be. In the same way, you know, there may be a couple of people at the top of the Air Force who really know what happened at Roswell, but the average employee doesn't. And so I think it's a similar concept where very often people just, you know, they look at anybody in government and everybody in government and say they're the bad guys. But, you know, they're not. I mean, 99.9% of, you know, you can look at any government and they're just regular people doing a job, and then they go home and play with the kids and hang out with the wife and watch TV or whatever. But there's no doubt that, I mean, in some cases, in terms of NASA, that, you know, we've got some weird stories coming out. For example, one case I talk about in the book occurred in Bolivia in 1978, where some sort of strange egg-shaped object crashed on a hillside, a forested hillside in Bolivia. And there are reports of the Bolivian military going out there and recovering this sort of 12 to 15 diameter egg-shaped object. And through the Freedom of Information Act, numerous documents have now surfaced showing that NASA took a great deal of interest in whatever this object was. In other words, it came down, the reports of the Bolivian military cordoning off the site, and talk of UFO encounters in the area in the days and weeks leading up to the event. So, you know, that sort of ties it with the UFO phenomenon. And NASA were definitely on the receiving end of these documents, and so they were clearly interested in whatever it was that came down. But when we try and get anything solid further, we just hit a brick wall. So, in other words, there are cases like this that suggest with more digging, you know, there might be more to the story.
Wow. I agree, too. Not all government is bad. You know, there's always a few bad apples in anything. Government, politics, you know, medical.
But like in any walk of life, you know, there are good and bad people. I think the problem is that people remember the bad ones. They don't remember the good work that gets done, you know, and that's unfortunate. You know, particularly when it comes to, you know, like for example, the Second World War. I mean, I hear people say, well, it was wrong to drop the bombs on Japan, the atomic bombs, but Germany and Japan started it, you know. People need to remember that, you know, we didn't just bomb Japan for the sake of it, we bombed it because they declared war on the West, you know. So, I mean, life's hard, life's tough, and things happen, and some people, you know, take this view or that view, and that's how it's always going to be. That's what, you know, that's what talk radio's about.
That's true. No, you know, my grandmother was in England. She's from England, and she moved to Canada. And when London was bombed by the Nazis, she was under the subways hiding.
Yeah.
And you know, so years later, she would always say these derogatory things about Germans, and I'm just like going, you know, why? You know, we're in America. You know. It's a melting pot. We're all one. And my dad would explain to me, well, you didn't live the life she lived when World War II was very vivid in her mind. So,
yeah, I mean, you know, those of us I wasn't born, you know, till the 60s.
Neither was I.
Yeah, and, you know, but I can understand how people who, say, fought in, you know, the Second World War and saw their friends, you know, shot down, bullets in them and killed, and, you know, I can understand why 50 years later they still hold that grudge. You know, people who didn't fight in the war probably wouldn't be able to understand it. But yeah, I mean, like with your mum, I mean, London was flattened by the Germans in the Second World War. People literally did have to go down into the, you know, the London Underground railway system to hide out while the bombs were being dropped. My mother and her parents, they lived in a city on the east coast of England called Norwich, which was bombed. They had like little bomb shelters in their backyard, like 10 feet deep, you know, where they'd race down when the sirens would ring. You know, we haven't had to live through that, and, you know, so in that sense I can understand why people have this, in some cases, still hatred of, the Nazis because, well, Hitler was an evil guy who tried to overtake the planet, and we had to do what we had to do to prevent it from happening,
That's true, and I think our government knew exactly what was going on. That's a topic for a whole other show with conspiracies. But even the Germans, I have friends who are German, and they told me, we suffered too. The Russians bombed Berlin. Animals in the zoo died. People died. People in Munich died. Because it wasn't like us Germans got a free ride or. We were...
No, they didn't get a free ride, but, they elected, it wasn't like Hitler took over the country, he was elected,
That's
and they
true.
backed him, they backed him in going into war, so...
That's true.
I don't have much, if they're going to declare war on you, and they're going to complain about it, well, I don't have that much sympathy, personally. So.
It always reminds me of Faulty Towers, when John Cleese said,
Oh, yeah.
"Whatever you do, don't mention the war."
Don't mention the war.
I know. Well, I wanted to ask, and I don't know if you want to... You have a new book coming out soon in 2015. Did I read that correctly on your blog?
Well, yeah, I have a book called Secret History, and it deals with sort of basically historical mysteries throughout not just the years, but the centuries and millennia. It has sections that go back to sort of the whole issue of like the ancient aliens, ancient astronauts era, looking at some of the very old ancient texts that can, in many respects, quite easily be applied to the UFO phenomenon. Things like, for example, Ezekiel's wheel, this strange phenomena that Ezekiel saw in the sky. So it has like a section that deals with things like that. Then it has a second, more up-to-date section of historical mysteries, like, for example, who was Jack the Ripper? Did John Wilkes Booth act alone when he shot President Lincoln? Things like that. And then there's an even more up-to-date section that deals with issues such as the UFO phenomenon and, what's the truth and is the information hidden from us in relation to UFOs. And it also looks at things like, why President, or who shot President Kennedy. I look at the theory, like, was it the KGB? Was it the Cubans? That kind of thing. Was it the Mafia? So there's sort of more up-to-date ones, and it's sort of, as I said, like a 2,500 year study of mysteries throughout, world culture and history.
And when is that out?
That's not out till, I think, round about the end of May of next year, so we're talking like another 7 or 8 months yet. But the way the publishing world works, they sort of get on the ball pretty quickly in terms of, advertising them and getting the designs all done and things like that.
Well, that's good. That's wonderful. Speaking of Kennedy, I wasn't even going to go here, but why not?
No, I don't mind. Go where you like. I don't mind.
Who killed him? And is it the same people that killed his brother and Marilyn Monroe as well?
Well, that's the big question. I mean, the problem with the Kennedy assassination is that when you look at it, there are so many theories, and some of the players, from the entirely different angles, seem to cross over, in the sense that, we've got, if you look at the Cuban angle, well, at the time, the Cubans and the Russians were heavily involved with each other, but then Lee Harvey Oswald had a link to Cuba, and he also had a link to Russia. He went to live there for a few years, and you've also got, some people have mentioned the idea of, well, it was the Mafia. Other people have said the CIA. Then other people have said, well, the CIA and the Mafia worked together on various programs. So in other words, you have this huge, confusing mess. My personal view is that because it's so sort of confusing and convoluted, I actually don't have sort of a definitive theory. What I do think, I don't believe that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. I think Oswald was involved. I don't think he was like a 100% patsy, as he called himself. What I think is that he was one of a number of people that were involved. Now, who those other people were from, whether it was the KGB or the Cubans or the Mafia or whoever, I don't know. But I think Oswald was part of a team, And I think he probably expected and intended to get away along with the rest of the team. And then at the last minute, when everybody was gone and he was left alone, he realised that he'd been set up to be not just the fall guy, but the only fall guy. And he was going to take the rap for whatever the big project was that, initiated the killing. Because if you look at all the different aspects to the case, I just don't think it's feasible that one man could have done all this and, all the other strands to the stories wouldn't exist if it was just him. So I do think there's a bigger conspiracy, and I do think Oswald was involved, but I think he just didn't anticipate being made the fall guy. And I think probably when Jack Ruby shot Oswald, I think that was done to prevent Oswald going to trial and the truth, spilling the beans on what he really knew. By killing him, the story, the truth went to the grave with him.
Now, do you think by any chance, and I've heard these conspiracies before, that Oswald was like a Manchurian candidate?
Well, yeah, that's an interesting theory because, Oswald spent time in the U.S. military and then he made this sudden move to Russia. And, U.S. authorities tried to convince him, they're like, don't go there, just because you're Marxist, you're going to go there and you're going to find it's not a nice place to live. But he's like, no, I want to go. And so he went to Russia, and a lot of weird stories about him where the Russians supposedly tried to turn him, to work for them, and stories about him becoming mind-controlled over there, or mind-controlled before he left, or like a sleeper agent spying on the Russians. In other words, his defection to Russia was like a ruse. But then you have the other story that it wasn't a ruse, but then when he came back and said he wanted to come back to the US because he hated Russia, there's a theory that was a ruse and that Russians were sending him, and that maybe he had been subliminally hypnotized to carry out the assassination. So, you've got so many weird strands and tangents to it that it's a fascinating story, but it's like so many of these old mysteries, actually sort of proving one theory over another is so difficult. I think the reason why it's so difficult with the Kennedy assassination is because we lack any sort of definitive smoking gun. I seriously doubt anybody who was involved in the assassination would ever have been so stupid to put something in writing that says something like, please send 3 assassins to Dealey Plaza to kill the president on November the 22nd. Nobody's going to put that into writing because of, the incriminating aspect of it. And so I think everything would have been word of mouth, and it would have been couched in such vague fashions that even if the phone calls were monitored, nobody would be able to prove what it was about, And so I think that's why it's hard to prove it, because we just don't have anything that's really definitive to go on that points to the finger of this person or that one,
Right, there's nothing substantial. There's so many ifs and ands out there.
But that, don't get me wrong, I'm not being skeptical. There's no doubt in my mind there was a conspiracy. Even the House Select Committee on Assassinations in the 70s concluded there was a second gunman. Ironically, they concluded that the second gunman actually missed his target and the shots were fired, the ones that Oswald fired, hit Kennedy. But they did conclude, this was the official House Senate committee, they concluded there was a conspiracy and a second gunman. A lot of people forget that. The Warren Commission said it was just Oswald, but the HSCA said no, there was a second gunman. So, and I agree with that. I think there was. It's just, how do we prove it sort of 51 years later now,
I know. Isn't there, and this is the last thing I'm going to talk about with Kennedy because we're coming down to like 3 minutes, but there's files that are supposed to be released. I don't know if they've already been released, or there's a certain date and time when they're released, and it's when everybody's dead. It's a generation that isn't going to know what happened, really, unless they really study up on it. Am I correct?
Well, the way it works is we have what's called, many countries have it, I should say, the Freedom of Information Act, and numerous countries around the world, like the US, Canada, Australia, France, the UK, New Zealand, they all have Freedom of Information Acts where, people can apply for government files. But many files can be withheld for a wide range of reasons, and sometimes they're withheld in full, and sometimes they're withheld in part. And at the last count, there was somewhere in the region of like 1,000 CIA documents on the Kennedy assassination, which had still yet to be released. Now, those documents, we don't know how long each individual document is. You know, it could be 3 pages, it could be 50 pages. So, although it's roughly 1,000 documents, it doesn't mean it's just 1,000 pages. It could be many more. And kind of like the Cuban Missile Crisis of '62 that Kennedy, you know, basically was you know, at the forefront of. Many files on the Cuban Missile Crisis are still classified 52 years later. So, although the Freedom of Information Act can be a good tool to open doors, it doesn't open all doors. And I doubt we will ever get to see all the files on the Kennedy assassination, but there's also a more critical issue as well. The fact that many files on the Kennedy assassination were actually destroyed and shredded years ago. For example, none other than Lee Harvey Oswald's Army intelligence file was destroyed in 1973. We have no idea what that says because it was destroyed, and what's weird is that even today there's not a real hard consensus on who it was that actually ordered the destruction of the file and under what circumstances it was destroyed, but it's gone. And so that, had that file survived, you know, and not been destroyed in '73, we probably would have had a great deal of information about Oswald's time, you know, and his links with Army intelligence.
Interesting. No, it's fascinating. I've actually been fascinated with that Kennedy assassination for years, and I'm one of those crazy conspiracy nuts. And Nick, you have been an awesome guest. We have covered it all: Bigfoot, UFOs, zombies. I pulled it off in 1 hour, and I'm pretty proud of myself for doing that. Nick, thank you so much for joining me this evening, folks. You can get his book, Close Encounters of the Fatal Kind, and the zombie book at Barnes & Noble and Amazon. Is that correct?
Yep, Barnes & Noble, Amazon, and people want to chat with me, they can just send me a friend request at Facebook. And I've also got a blog called World of Whatever, where people can reach me as well.
Now, I did try to friend you on Facebook, and I'm unfollowing you now, but it said you had to be...
Did it say there were too many friends or something?
You have too many friends. You're
yeah, well, what I'll do, for some weird reason, if I send it to you, even though it says I've got too many friends, if I send it to you and you accept me, then it goes through okay. So I'll do that.
Okay.
I'll send you the request, and if you accept it, it should be okay then.
Perfect. That'll work. And you've been a great guest, and I'd love to have you on again in a year or so.
Yeah, I'll be pleased to, and whenever you want me to, or if there's any breaking news and you want me on last minute, just give me a shout.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Nick. It was a pleasure having you this evening, and good luck.
Thanks, Bill.
Get your new one. Have a great evening.
You too. Bye.
All right, folks. It's been an incredible evening. Such a great guest to interview. I was so excited to have him on, and I actually covered more than I thought I would cover in an hour, and I'm actually really happy. I pulled that one off. Very proud of myself with a fractured rib. Anyway, everyone, have a wonderful, wonderful weekend. Next week, I am joined by my friend Star. She is a room sister of mine, and we will be discussing Wicca, witchcraft, and the realm of magic. Perfect time of year for this, don't you think? Anyway, everyone have a blessed weekend, and we will be back here next week. Good night, everybody.